Cue the sentimental music and sad-eyed dogs. Today, we're talking about pathos. Emotions kind of get a bad rap these days. In our modern sophisticated world, we want to be all intellect all the time. Logic is what counts. We just want the facts, and if only people could be objective and logical, everything would turn out better. But here's the thing, people just aren't rational and objective. People have feelings. Now, emotions are not some kind of villainous force that we have to overcome in order to have grown-up conversations. Emotions are an important and unavoidable part of our lives and are therefore an important and unavoidable part of writing rhetorically. And so because of that, rhetoricians for centuries have talked about pathos, a sort of shorthand term for the emotional side of rhetoric. Now, before we go too far, I do want to talk about the word pathos. For my whole life, I only ever heard people say pathos. And then one day, I went to graduate school in another part of the country, and then everybody around me was saying pathos. Pathos? It kind of seemed weird to me. But I'll confess that I did do some research on how to pronounce this word before I put myself on the internet. And it turns out that not a single dictionary in the world that I could find recognizes pathos as a legitimate pronunciation of the word. So I guess I'm wrong, but I'm not going to go down without a fight. Pathos, of course, is a Greek word, and you know what definitely isn't the correct original Greek pronunciation of the word? Pathos. There isn't a universe in the world where that vowel would make that sound. In fact, my light internet research indicates that it would be pronounced pathos, with a vowel that isn't as far back as ah or as far forward as ah. But you know, for me, pathos seems a whole lot closer to the original than pathos. And what's more, there are a lot of other words in English that have the same root and don't make the A sound, right? It's not pathology. We don't talk about psychopaths or having empathy. So pathos might be the most officially correct way to pronounce the word, but it seems like a random anomaly when you compare it to the original Greek and also to every other related word in English. So I'm sticking with pathos, and I'm probably wrong, but I do have good reasons for it. And if that's a reason for you to leave, well then I'll give you a minute to do that. Now, I sort of get why pathos has a bad reputation. We sort of think about it as all those dirty little tricks that people use to manipulate you when they don't really have good reasons to support their claims. And probably when you learn about pathos, you see those advertisements with the dogs in cages listening to sad music. But the point of all of that is not to persuade you. Really what's happening is they're manipulating you and using your emotions and exploiting them in order to try and get you to do something. And so whether it's for a good cause or not, manipulating people's emotions is not what I'm talking about here. In fact, I'm not ever going to talk about manipulation because manipulation is rhetoric's evil twin. That's not persuasion, that's exploiting people. But that doesn't mean that all appeals to emotion are manipulative, and it definitely doesn't mean that as a writer you don't have to pay attention to your readers' feelings. You do have to be tuned in to what your audience is feeling about you and about your argument if what you write is going to be persuasive. And so that brings me to our definition of pathos. Pathos is whatever you do in order to help your audience to become emotionally invested in your argument. So pathos is about emotions, but it's not about guilt or tears. It's about emotional investment. It's about caring. If people don't care about what you're writing, they're never going to be persuaded by it. Because here's the thing, even if we like to imagine that we're super smart and logical all the time, the fact is that emotions play a really big role in what we do and what we choose to do. We don't just do things because they make logical sense, we do them because we like them, because we feel good about them. And so maybe that's why you're putting off going to the dentist. Even though you know with your head and with the facts and the reasons that going to the dentist is a good thing to do, it's also possible that you just can't bring yourself to sit in one of those chairs and have those lights shine in your face while somebody pokes around in your mouth for an hour. Even though you know, logically, that going to the dentist is good, emotionally, it can be a hard thing to do. It makes objective sense, but you're never going to go if your emotions stop you from doing it. In fact, when I was a kid, I had a dentist who I think knew a thing or two about Pathos. He didn't advertise to his potential patients by talking about all the 9 out of 10 dentists' things about taking care of your teeth. He didn't advertise his cutting-edge equipment or his highly trained staff. He didn't need to teach his patients that going to the dentist was a good thing. He didn't need to give them the facts. They already knew the facts. That was not the problem. He knew that it wasn't just ignorance that was keeping patients from going to the dentist. He knew that it was fear, that it was feelings that were preventing them from going, even though they knew that they should. And so he didn't educate his potential patients. Instead, he tried to address their emotions, to try to help them to be more comfortable, to downplay their fears, and to get his audience more invested in his approach to dentistry. Really, he wanted them to care about the way that he did his job. Instead of listing the facts in order to persuade people to come to him as their dentist, instead he took a different approach. He talked about how there were TVs at every chair. He talked about the train station decor of the waiting room and the little model trains that ran through the office at various times of day. He even talked about how his office didn't smell like a typical dentist's office. He knew that people would have negative emotional reactions to that sort of typical dentist's office smell, and he wanted to make sure that he addressed even that. What's more, he didn't talk about how his staff was skilled, he talked about how they were friendly. In his waiting room, he had picture books and a Nintendo to make it feel more like somebody's living room. But why go to all the trouble and expense of making your dentist's office look like a train station and smell like a fancy candle? None of that tells your audience about why you're a better dentist or why they should go to you. Not logically anyway, it didn't give them the facts. None of it really makes any rational sense. He knew that emotions run high when it comes to going to the dentist. He knew that if he wanted to persuade his audience to make him their dentist, he was going to have to deal with those strong emotions and make people want to go to him instead of any of the other dentists they could go to. Because people don't really care about your skills or your equipment or your experience if they're too scared or angry or upset to even listen. The only way that that dentist could make his case to his audience was if he used strategies that fall under the umbrella of Pathos. If he was going to get his audience to care at all instead of running away, he had to talk about people's feelings first. And you know, it must have worked. He was our dentist for years. So, needless to say, how you work with your audience's emotions in a given piece of writing will vary from situation to situation. If you're my old dentist, you need to put emotions front and center because that's what's preventing your audience from listening to what you have to say. If you're writing a scientific research article, though, you probably don't want to put emotions front and center because your audience isn't prepared for and probably won't accept a highly emotional piece of writing. But even if you're writing scientifically, you can't afford to ignore your audience's feelings altogether because you still need to do some work to help them to be emotionally invested in what you're writing. Because if they don't care about the significance of your findings or the work that you're doing, they're not going to read your writing, and it's not going to make a difference. So even if you're being very objective and scientific, you do still need to help your audience care about what you're writing. And that requires being aware of how they feel and what their emotions are doing as they read. Of course, in such a situation, you might not be working with very strong emotions, but you're still working with emotions nonetheless. And as we talk about other categories of rhetorical strategies, one thing that we'll see is that they never work independently or separately. Sure, there might be a lot of pathos in a dentist's rhetorical strategies, and there might be less in a scientific research article, but you'll still see it in both places, just in different ways and to varying degrees. So to wrap up, whenever you're looking at pathos, you're looking at those rhetorical strategies that people use to get their audience emotionally invested in their argument. So for example, anything that gets an audience excited, anything that reminds them of the good old days, anything that makes them laugh, eases their fear, stokes their righteous indignation, or fires up their empathy is a rhetorical strategy covered by pathos. Emotions are an unavoidable and essential part of the human experience, and they're powerful too. Sure, they can be manipulated, but that doesn't mean we should ignore them or wish them away. Instead, we should be aware of how emotions work and how arguments can affect the way people feel. Then with that awareness, we can write more carefully and more sensitively, not just hammering our audience with the facts, but also giving them reasons to care and helping them to understand that we're on their side. Really, helping your audience feel comfortable with you and with your argument is what Pathos is all about. So that's all for today. If you have any questions about Pathos or about writing in general, leave them in the comments down below, and I'll see you next time. But that doesn't mean that all appeals to emotion are manipulative, and it definitely doesn't mean that as a writer, you should ignore your writer's feelings. Your writer's feelings, how about your reader's feelings? Like to see emotions front and center. They want the science, not the feelings. But even then, you can't ignore their feelings altogether. Because along the way, at some point, you're still going to want to help your audience to be emotionally invested in what you're reading. Nope, what you're writing. I do that all the time.